Hello, and thank you for tuning in to The Christian Skeptic. I'm your host, Sean Kerwin, and as always, it's my mission to take an honest look at our questions about Christianity through the lens of logic and reason. I'm not here to preach at you, just to start a conversation with you. I hope you enjoy the show. Okay, this is a complex topic, and these episodes are 20 minutes long. And we're going to attempt to discuss today over 200 years of history with so many intricate and complicated storylines woven throughout this thing that we've reduced to just a single term called the Crusades. The Crusades began officially in the late 11th century, and they fizzled out and ended, I would say unofficially, the seventh one, at the dawn of the 14th century. So we're talking 1095 AD to about 1305 AD. And so to ask a question, were the Crusades justified? There's kind of a couple folds that we must recognize in this answer. And I think the first one is just the most simplistic one, which if you're just going to listen to this one answer might also be the most offensive one. But were the Crusades justified? The answer is yes. Of course they were. They were justified to the people doing the Crusades. Now, was that justification correct is a whole nother story, but I think it's important to start here and to realize that people had a reason for doing this. It wasn't just mass hysteria and madness that took over. And I think that's important to pause and recognize because we live in a day and age, we live post-reductionist philosophy, that it's easy just to turn something into a soundbite. And we see that with things that happen as they happen, that you're just going to get the soundbite of what actually happened, and to uncover the full story actually takes work. And it's even easier to do that with something that happened 700, 800, 900 years ago. That it's easy to look at the Crusades and just say, this is an example of Christianity gone wrong. This is an example of a bunch of Christians committing a bunch of violent acts, and see, this is the kind of thing that religion leads to. Religion leads to mass hysteria. Religion leads to people hating another group of people because they think that they are going to hell, or they think that they're bringing hell on earth. And there are two conflicting ideas. One is a just holy war, and one is a jihad, which are really kind of the same idea for different purposes. And so this is probably going to be a multi-part talk that we have. I don't know that I'm going to get through the entirety of what the Crusades mean in just one episode, but we need to start somewhere, and we should probably just start with the start of the Crusades and the thought process that led into them and caused Europe to be in such a time of conflict and upheaval that really turns this into what maybe is even more properly looked at as the First World War, maybe the first 7 world wars. But if we're going to reduce the Crusades to a single word, Crusades, I mean, this really flipped the entire known world on its head. You had the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, teaming up with the Byzantine Empire, which is what we call the remnant of the broken down rubble of what was once the Roman Empire. But the part that I think we find most offensive and hard to process is that this is really the only example in history, especially on a large scale, of war happening with Christianity as the justification for it. And so you have the Holy Roman Empire versus the Seljuk Turks and the whole Turkish Empire that swept through the known world with strength and power and wealth in a way that we probably hadn't seen since the Persian Empire. And so before we ask if the Crusades were justified, what about the Seljuk Turk conquest of Byzantine lands? Was that justified? Well, in the Seljuks' mind, yes, it was. Obviously, in the mind of a Byzantine, no, it was not. But for the Seljuks, they saw a crumbling empire. They saw an empire that was about to lose and abuse the vast resources, wealths of knowledge, and that if the Seljuks could come in and conquer these people and convert them to Islam, some of them, not every city was actually like this. Now, to be fair, Islamic historians do record that many cities, including Jerusalem, were cities where the Seljuk Turks allowed Christians and Jews to continue in their practices of Judaism and Christianity. And sure, there are stories on both sides of the aisle of the conquerors coming into the city and forcing or killing those who do not wish to convert to the conquering religion. But there are also many stories of that not happening, of coexistence being allowed to thrive in a conquered city. And here I think we can maybe come to the first disagreement between jihad and the just war. And so we'll start with jihad. Jihad is the holy war. Jihad is the principle set forth by Islam that is to usher in the end of the age, that is to usher in a fully Islamic world who believes the words of the Prophet Muhammad, where justice and judgment reign supreme, and the entire world is converted to what Muslims believe is the one true religion, Islam. And standing in conflict with this is a concept that Pope Urban, who was the Pope at the time that the Crusades began, leaned heavily on from someone who existed in the church long before the Crusades. And that man was Augustine of Hippo. Now, if you've listened to this podcast in the past, you know that Augustine of Hippo is a very wise and credible Christian theologian who lived at the end of the 4th and beginning of the 5th century in Hippo, which is a territory in Egypt. And Augustine wrote a very famous book that, when translated, means the city of God. And in the city of God, Augustine said, "They say, a wise man will wage just wars, and if he would not all the rather lament the necessity of just wars, if he remembers that he is a man. For if they were not just, he would not wage them, and would therefore be delivered from all wars." And so there we see Augustine's kind of formation of the idea of a just war. And he later responds to a man named Faustum or Faustus in what we have as the work called the Contra Faustum, which is just the reply to Faustus, is really what that means, that he kind of expands on the idea of Romans 13:4, where Paul lays out this Christian principle, which is to let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. And so Augustine takes that and says, based on that, in his Contra Faustum, he says, there are those who have waged war in obedience to the divine command or in conformity with his laws. They have represented in their persons the public justice or the wisdom of government, and in this capacity have put to death wicked men. Such persons have by no means violated the commandment, thou shalt not kill. No war is undertaken by a good state except on behalf of good faith or for safety. And so Augustine's idea of a just war is something that kind of rings true in just a common discovered moral sense, is that there exists in this world an evil, and there exists in this world people who will be victims of that evil. And it's the responsibility of strong people who love justice to defend those that cannot defend themselves against that evil. And so in Augustine's mind, that's the justification for war, that if war is to keep evil at bay, minimize abuse of victims who are powerless to defend themselves against that evil, then it is the responsibility of Christians and of a government and Christians in the government to defend the powerless against evil. And I think that makes sense to our modern ears. I think it's easy to picture something like that with the Holocaust. When we see Nazi Germany torturing people to death simply because of their race and religion, we can look at that and say that is wrong, and it's our right to go stop that evil from happening because 6 million people have been executed in concentration camps, and if we don't stop it now, that number's just going to exponentially grow. And that makes sense because we're stopping an evil. And so that's Augustine's idea of a just war or a holy war. And so beginning in 1095, Pope Urban begins a tour kind of going through the Holy Roman Empire. And he starts in France, and there's this council of Clermont. And on this tour, he announces that it's the Holy Roman Empire's job to team up with the Byzantine Empire and campaign against the Seljuk Turks. And the Seljuk Turks, again, have committed some atrocities in some of their conquering cities. And so they're not without examples of violence and abuse that would warrant such action. There's a problem here, though, is that as Pope Urban starts to tour, and as this message gains popularity, which is very interesting, that these people living in France are going to march all the way over to Turkey on foot and fight a battle for land that isn't theirs in an empire that contains fragments of what was, so therefore people that they don't even identify with anymore, is very fascinating. But he does. He rallies them, and I can't help but wonder if part of that is because the message began to actually twist. You see, as he was building this force, what we end up with is the first part of the crusade is something called the People's Crusade, which is a bunch of peasants that took it upon themselves to march. And one of the main reasons they did that was because the message began to be spread. And I don't know if it came from Pope Urban or not. History's not clear on that. But the message began to be spread that a crusade is a pilgrimage. And the end goal is to reach Jerusalem and take it back from the Turks. The end goal is to reach the Holy Land. And if the Holy Catholic Church takes back the Holy Land of Jerusalem, that will usher in the second coming of Christ, and anyone who participates in a crusade has all of their sins forgiven and will have salvation. And that is wrong, right? Like, it's not off to a good start. And so it's complex and complicated. And so what happens? Well, these peasants march, and the royals and the actual knights and the actual armies see the peasants march, and they just let it happen. And the peasants take things way too far. They're not trained soldiers. They're not trained clergymen. It's brutal, and they commit atrocities, and eventually they're all wiped out. And the soldiers and the rulers who are supposed to care for the peasants and watch out for them let them march to a brutal, disgusting end. And so before the actual crusade even march, and before the actual soldiers go and commit atrocities, and that happens, there's a lot of that, they commit an atrocity on their own people by letting these unskilled, untrained peasants think they're marching to their salvation, and really they're committing some of the worst sins they've probably ever committed along the way, and then they're eventually massacred. So it's not off to a good start. But immediately following that, the soldiers march. Immediately following that, King Philip I of France and a few other nobles and royalties gather together an actual army, and they march towards Antioch. And Antioch is a famous city in the history of the Bible, and so it has a lot of significance. It's also one of the major capitals of the Byzantine Empire that was sieged and taken over by the Seljuk Turks. And so they get to Antioch, and they didn't bring enough food, and their numbers started dwindling very quickly. And these Byzantines had previously just captured Nicaea, or Nicaea, however you pronounce it, and had lost a lot of soldiers in that battle, but they conquered it, and they made their way towards Antioch. After a grueling march, they dwindled down from about 100,000 crusaders to about 40,000 crusaders. And then they began to siege the city. But they underanticipated the strength of the Seljuk Turks at Antioch, and the siege lasted way too longer, so long that famine, disease, and even just desertion started to set in. Crusaders started going home until this moment where it's hard to understand if he was a mystic or if he was a monk or a priest of some sort, but this man, Peter Bartholomew, rallies the people together by digging in the ground outside of Antioch and uncovering the Holy Lance. And the Holy Lance is this relic that they believed was the spear that pierced the side of Christ on the cross. You know the story. Jesus dies on the cross. They say he's already dead. A Roman soldier pierces his side with a spear, and blood and water pour out, telling them that, yes, he is indeed already dead. He has drowned in his own blood and water. Well, Peter Bartholomew says he finds that lance here outside of Antioch, and it rallies these disease-ridden, hungry, whittled-down crusaders, and they're able to defeat the great General Kerboga, is his name. You can look this up, at Antioch, and he's one of the greatest generals of the Seljuk Empire of that time. And this starts what is an entirely different conversation about the presence of relics in the Catholic Church, which you can go visit in Italy and in the Vatican and various churches around Europe today and see that there are these relics that they claim have this connection to Christ or to the apostles. Or I mean, it's weird. They literally like preserve bones in jars for hundreds of years. And it's hard to reconcile in my mind that someone can do this and still profess the faith and still preach the gospel of Christ, which has nothing to do with relics or the idolization of relics or the worship of them or even the preservation of them. And so that starts a whole nother conversation that we can get into as a part of this theme of Crusades in a later episode if you want. But all of that to say, the Crusaders take Antioch and then they head to Jerusalem. And so they march to Jerusalem. And I know this episode is sounding a bit like a history lesson, but I'm coming to a point here. And they wage war and they siege Jerusalem. And these hungry, tired, disease-ridden, and depleted crusaders, filled with such pious, vitriolic rage, sack Jerusalem. And they have some help, and the battle's intense, and I really encourage you to look into it, but we're running out of time for this episode here, and I want to get to my main point. But they enter Jerusalem, and they kill everybody inside. It's recorded the blood of Jerusalem was running so hot that it was up above people's ankles as they walked through the street, that the smell of death and blood did not leave Jerusalem for 6 months after the Crusaders sacked it, that they killed every single Muslim in Jerusalem. They also killed every single Jewish person that was living in Jerusalem, and they killed a bunch of Christians that were living in Jerusalem. There's stories of Crusade generals realizing that these people are just being mercilessly killed. And there's one story of a general who goes around and he gives this group of Muslims and Jews hiding in a quarter, he gives them his like general flag, his banner, right? And he's like, wave this, say you're with me and they won't kill you. And the other Crusaders come and they see this flag and they don't care and they kill them anyway. And it's horrible. And it's not justified. To get to the kind of more in-depth answer to this question, are the Crusades justified? Well, sure, they were justified at the time. And there's an in-between answer, and I'm not trying to break Aristotle's law of excluded middle here by giving you a, well, it kind of is and it isn't kind of answer, but there is an in-between answer that history would not be the way that it is without the Crusades, and that's fair enough. And you go to Spain, or you go to Italy, and you tour museums and cathedrals, and the Crusades are actually held in high regard. But you go to Turkey, you go to Iran, and I've never been to those places, but I've heard that there's even a thought in some Muslim communities that the Crusades never ended and that the West is now waging crusades on Muslim land. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that we can point to the Crusades being a defined moment in history between the end of the 11th century and the beginning of the 14th century, and that what we have formally defined as Crusades did end. And then there's the answer of no. The atrocities, the acts committed in the Crusades in the name of either jihad or a just war were not justified. That some of this is what no God would want for people to do to each other. The pillaging, the violence, the murders, the beheading, the rapes, none of that can ever be justified. And so we have to approach the Crusades carefully and recognize that we don't live in that time, that people had reasons for doing it. And the Peasants' Crusade, the People's Crusade, most of them, their reason was they thought they were getting salvation out of the crusade. And that is wrong, and they were lied to, and that's so not justified. Perhaps for some of the rulers and the knights who had to flee Antioch, perhaps for Emperor Alexios of the Byzantine Empire, who watched the Armenian lands be emptied out by Seljuk Turk forces. Perhaps he wanted to defend those that couldn't defend themselves. Maybe. Part of it, at least, right? And there's no doubt that had the Crusades not happened, had these two factions of what was once the Roman Empire, I mean, really more than two when you look at kind of the different territories. Anyway, I'm getting in the weeds here, but had this shaken up puzzle box of what was left of the Roman Empire in Europe not rallied together and had crusades, much of what we know now as modern Europe probably would not be what it is today. Much of the art, history, and liberties that define places like Italy and Spain and France and Germany, and the reason why these areas hold a certain magic and wonder when you visit them, that might not exist today had it not been for the Crusades. And that's a reality that I think we need to face when considering this. Is Europe might very well be today part of the Muslim world. And for what it is, there are a lot of parts of the Muslim world that are too dangerous for people to travel to. And that's probably a conversation for a different episode. And so there's a tension I think we need to sit with. I think the actual conclusion I'll make is no. The Crusades were not justified in the way that they went about them. Perhaps had Emperor Alexios and Pope Urban gone about the organization, the rallying, and the messaging of the Crusades differently, and stuck to Augustinian philosophy of a just war, an Augustinian philosophy that says bring peace, justice, and mercy to all peoples, perhaps they would have been undertaken in a way that would have been justified. And really that idea comes from the book of Esther in the Bible. And when Esther's trying to save her people, her cousin, Mordecai, says, it's up to you. You can do what's right. And if you choose not to, God will find a way. He will bring deliverance by another means. And so I think in the light of the consideration of the world is the way it is now, and the Crusades had something to do with it, there's also a Christian rationale that says God's will is going to come about regardless of our participation in it. But he would rather our participation be one of justice and mercy and grace. And so there's a part of me that hopes, had the Crusades emphasized justice, mercy, and grace, maybe history would look at them in a different light. But unfortunately, as I already said, the Holy Roman Empire was not Roman nor an empire, but it also wasn't holy, meaning that it wasn't actually a nation state of nothing but Christians and believers. There were parts of it where the church had become corrupted by the state, and therefore a lot of sin, a lot of wrong was introduced into the Crusades, as we could probably expect it to be. And unfortunately, we are out of time for this episode, and I don't know where I'm going to take the next one, but let me know your thoughts. This is a complicated, complex, not easy thing to understand or answer. So let's continue this conversation. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed the show.